Welcome to By the Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 52nd episode of By the Bywater. It is great to be back with you all, as always. We hope things are going well. All I can tell you right now is in San Francisco, it's decided to be really, really windy today. So if you hear occasional rattlings of windows and things in the background, it's not me. It's not an earthquake. It's just that. So, but we hope everyone's going well. And we were just chatting with Oriana before we started recording. She is mere days away from her next big adventure, i.e. moving back across the country.
Yay!
And they're talking about strategies about how to have binged up podcasts to listen to not fall asleep while driving across the upper Midwest. Very good strategy, I have to say. So, and let's see. So remind me, you've seen the place you're moving into, but you haven't been to it yet, or you have been to it?
We
yet?
stayed. Yeah, we cat sat for some friends. So we're just basically taking over from them. So it's great.
Cool thing. So
yeah, it's not a scam. My it's not a scam T-shirt is raising a lot of questions.
Amazing what we learn here. So by the time this episode comes out, she and her guy will be back over there and settled in, and so the next episode will be a once again split between East Coast and West Coast times, but we'll make it work. It'll all happen. We did it before. So
yeah. We'll get a bi-coastal perspective.
One more time, yeah. There'll be a case where, Jared and I might be over here going like, oh, it's nice over there. You'll be like, the wind or something like that. We'll be like, okay. So, yes.
Well, now we can do a New York live show, so.
Yes, and, believe
I love
me,
that, the live shows follow me.
Yeah.
I'm I don't know, is that good? Is that bad? Am I high maintenance?
I treat it as a good excuse for a trip.
Yeah, there
Look,
we
my
go.
assumption, not to be that bitch, but my assumption is that I will be in New York for a book event at some point, which will be a good excuse.
Oh my god!
Again,
I hope you are that bitch all the time.
Yes. And once again, once we have word, we will post the pre-order links, but it's still not ready yet. So
I'm going. Happen. Everybody asks. I'm like, I don't know. There's not even a cover yet. I don't know when pre-orders open. Stop asking.
I'm entirely patient.
It's not until
patient. It will happen when it does.
The publication is not till what, November of next year?
Yeah.
No. Summer 2024.
Oh, okay. So about a year from now. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's coming up.
No, because your birthday's in November. That's what I confused.
Yeah.
It's going to be a rebirth.
Yes. Yes.
A veritable renaissance.
Yeah.
Oh my. Okay, well, more on that at a later time, but we should get into things. We not only have, of course, the main topic to get into, but we've got some actual news of sorts to discuss. So we might as well just get right into that. So, Jared, please, as always, do take it away.
Yeah, a lot going on this month. The big news is that Tolkien Estate and HarperCollins have announced a reissue of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien to be published later this year in November. Maybe that's what Oriana was thinking of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it isn't a new edition as such. Both Christopher Tolkien and Humphrey Carpenter will be credited as on the original edition, even though they both have now passed. But it will include a further 150 letters that were removed for space reasons before its original publication. No word on what exactly will be included in these new letters. Various uncollected letters have been reported on and quoted in research and discussion in the past, so hopefully this will include those as well as some wholly new ones. Otherwise, we'll have to wait and see. Meantime, the Annecy Festival panel on Warner Brothers' forthcoming anime The War of the Rohirrim went as planned, as was described in our last episode. No full screening or anything close to it, but 2 scenes in progress were shown, along with detailed discussion from the filmmakers about what's planned. More about the characters and the general plot were revealed as well. Another important note was a reconfirmation that it will be released theatrically, with April 12th of 2024 as the stated date. We'll have a link in our show notes to the detailed report on the panel over at theonering.net. And filming finished on Season 2 of The Rings of Power. The end.
Yep. Nothing more need to be said there. So, yeah, getting into the Annecy Festival report and all that. Now that we have a new adaptation to hopefully look forward to, because we've been burned already once before on this podcast. But in this case, I mean, I did make a joke when the description of Hera. I know, Jared.
God,
I know
that every time I'm just like. Can't even articulate it.
Our lead character, as such, who is the daughter of Helm, who has been given a name in the story. Again, she is mentioned in the original text, which again can be found in the appendices as a name here. And this was just me, but I just read the description of her having like unruly red hair and is sort of a bit of a sort of tomboy figure. And I basically said I sent in our Discord channels like, is this Marita from Brave? What's going on here?
She's not like other girls.
Probably not what they're intending. But jokes aside, I'm still down with this. This seems like it'll be, at the very least, on the one hand, it ties in with what Jared said before, and I think there's a very good point on this, that we're sort of over determining a particular design style for Middle-earthen adaptations. The Rings of Power essentially ripped it off. In this case, this is meant to slot directly into it with the Jackson adaptation, so perhaps unavoidable. I'd love to see a completely unconstrained anime adaptation of Tolkien, just going with inventing some design stuff from the ground up. But, who knows, maybe in the future. Having said that, though, we'll see. Sounds promising. And the letters.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting. That's going to be really interesting. It really makes me wonder. I mean, they say that was cut for space reasons. Were there other reasons? Are we going to get more? Is there stuff that's still being kept out? For whatever reason. Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, they're making it sound like Christopher Tolkien and Carpenter had decided on these beforehand, but they just couldn't put it in for space. Does that mean they're just simply elaborations on what's there?
Pieces of, drafts that never, I don't know.
Yeah, because the original collection did publish a lot of drafted letters that apparently were never sent, which in some cases
so funny.
So
funny.
It's sort of like, we're glad they exist because it's sort of like, hey, great, more information.
This is why I delete all my draft emails, because if I suddenly die, I don't need anyone to uncover those.
This is an understandable and good strategy. So, but it is interesting. I mean, it's a kind of a shift given the last few books that have been published. Hey, one of which we're about to talk about have been more focusing on the creative work as such. This is an interesting sort of switch back to not even scholarly text, but just the collection form of letters. And what'll be interesting to my mind, this is one of those minor things, but there's a truth to it, is that so many of the letters have been identified now, talking about, in letter 123 or whatever, things like that. Now it's sort of like, okay, are they going to completely reorder the renumber the letters and sort of salt them in and be like, okay, now we mean this one. So
that hadn't even occurred to me. I hope they just put it at the end, so now it's like just an addition rather tthan reorder. Ugh.
Right, yeah. I mean, I can think of Tolkien Gateway's entries for the letters alone. Well, someone there is probably going,
no.
Those poor nerds at Tolkien Gateway.
Alternately, possibly going, yes, an excuse to revisit everything.
You never know. Put in new stuff and all that. So that is interesting to learn about. Certainly, we'll have more when it comes out, but that won't be for some time yet. So until the end of the year. The Rings of Power finished filming fine. And we'll sort of quickly tie into that. No update on a certain strike that's going on, although with the Screen Actors Guild, again, having basically overwhelmingly voted to go on strike if they need to. And with that contract coming up in less than 2 weeks now, as of the time we're recording, I mean, hopefully by the time this episode comes out in early July, we may have some decisions one way or another, but otherwise...
I was fortunate enough. I was down in LA sort of mid-May. I can't remember if I talked about that on.
You did.
I did. Okay.
On the last time.
Boy. The strike is the WGA strike is very important. SAG's potential strike is possibly even more important. These organizations are both fighting for the future of entertainment to not suck a whole bunch. So really encourage anyone who is still kind of like, what are these babies whining about, to kind of I don't know, talk to me. I'll I have information for you and
explain.
direct experience
Yes.
about that. So
Yeah. They're not just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for all of us. Like, do you want the future of entertainment to be just AI content generated? Like,
oh my God. Do you want script engineers to be the ones who are, creating the things that you shove in your eyeballs?
I don't.
But
I know this is kind of a preaching to the choir moment, but like, yeah, you don't get, nobody gains anything by
Yeah.
having
it's not
generated content.
Especially because it's not just that, it's not that there is no bad stuff coming out right now.
Yeah.
It's not that there isn't bad writing, bad art, but a future that is, that hinges on software writing and, crafting images is one that precludes those moments of brilliance.
It's a future with nothing new in it. It's a future
Yeah.
that just rehashes what you've already
Yeah.
done. And even though I've seen people make the argument that like AI art or whatever is like it's not doing anything different from a human artist. Like a human artist, you take influences and kind of
Yeah.
recast them to a certain extent, but that's still like that's not quite what a human artist is doing.
It's not only
Yeah.
It totally disregards the idea that human beings are capable of creating something new, that there is a sort of gestalt happening where, yes, you can have lots of different influences, but what you are creating, is based on that, but there is still something more that you as the artist are adding to it. And that doesn't exist with what is being referred to as AI and is really just,
it's not
plagiarism
intelligent.
software.
Yeah. It's not actually intelligent. It's just reiterating things that already exist, which is different from what a human artist does.
Sorry to derail.
No.
But it's an important conversation, I guess.
It's very important because, after all, on the one hand, if we get further adaptations, which inevitably seem to be coming, they should be done with some sort of deal in place. And when it comes to creativity in things that are not computer driven and are just one person's sort of creative vision, hey, we got an example to talk about that with the main topic today for sure. Although one that has been given a new light by how it's been put together. But I'm about to talk about that. The choice of topic has come around to me, and so I shall begin. The Fall of Numenor is, on the face of it, the newest posthumous work by J.R.R. Tolkien. Which, true, but not quite in the vein of much of what's happened since the Silmarillion. As previously discussed in our episode on the nature of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien's final efforts at reviewing and presenting his father's work were based around the three great tales of the First Age. Nature was prepared by longtime Tolkien linguistic scholar Carl Hostetter, drawing on an apparently last collection of random drafts and efforts sent to him by Christopher that the latter hadn't gotten around to fully. The Fall of Numenor, in distinct contrast, doesn't present anything new at all, but is instead a collation drawing on previously published work both before and after Tolkien's death, and even including some material that had just recently surfaced in The Nature of Middle-earth itself. Arguably, it reflects the blunt necessity that, perhaps a few scattered exceptions aside, at long last there is simply no more work by Tolkien to publish, and whatever further has to be presented from his legendarium will simply be showcasing work that already exists. But that said, it actually works given the audience this is aimed at. Its editor is a familiar name in Tolkien circles, Brian Sibley, who first came to notice as the main writer behind the BBC radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings in the early 1980s, then as a writer of numerous books covering the production of Peter Jackson's various Tolkien adaptations, as well as work directly done with the estate, like the Maps of Tolkien's Middle-earth collection, done in collaboration with John Howe. If Sibley is not per se one of the quote-unquote academic Tolkien researchers like Hostetter, Tom Shippey, or the team of Wayne Hammett and Christina Scull, his high public profile in the fandom places him as a great popularizer and celebrator of Tolkien's work more widely, a trusted voice. Even more important is the evident goal Sibley was aiming for, whether prompted by his own conception, or perhaps taking something further on board. Though it is not directly referred to at all in his introductory notes, Sibley would hardly be unaware that the rights deal the estate worked out with Amazon was centered on a series set during the Second Age, drawing on the chronology provided in the Lord of the Rings appendices. Whereas the First Age had been represented for decades by the Silmarillion, what extant text covered the Second Age had essentially been presented in selections and summaries across many of the posthumous works, including from the Silmarillion itself, a notable section of Unfinished Tales, various entries in the History of Middle-earth series, and finally, as noted, The Nature of Middle-earth. Though not directly marketed as a tie-in to the premiere season of The Rings of Power, even though it was released just a couple of months after that series debuted, The Fall of Numenor is essentially, if, due to the complexities of the rights situation, not intentionally directly, the quote-unquote source material for the show for those interested and likely unfamiliar readers, using the Lord of the Rings chronology as a frame to present those scattered texts in a new overall form to create as close to a formal narrative as possible. In this regard, The Fall of Numenor takes the form of Christopher's last two volumes of the Great Tales, Beren and Luthien and The Fall of Gondolin, in that instead of telling a clean story, it presents these selections as fragments of a larger whole, some barely presenting any more details beyond the source chronology, and some showcasing deeply detailed efforts. Unsurprisingly, a bulk of the text is made up of the largest extant narrative from the setting of Numenor, Aldarion and Erendis, the Mariner's wife, which we discussed in greater detail in episode 4 of this podcast. As we said then, we hoped there was a way to showcase the story more widely, so it's nice to see that happen here, though by default it's a pity that the rich detail of that story is nowhere near replicated with anything else in the book. Tolkien wrote about what he chose to when he chose to do it, so we can only express regret that it wasn't otherwise. But this said, Sibley's presentation is a valuable way to take in all this material in one place to get a sense of the broad outlines and currents. If The Fall of Numenor itself was familiar enough from the Akalabeth section of the Silmarillion, there's enough further details from the other books discussing how the slow corruption of the society unfolded, the conflicts between Sauron and the Free Peoples throughout the Second Age in Eriador and beyond, and more to help serve as reminders of the scope of what Tolkien attempted to outline, 3,000 years plus of history, a daunting prospect by any measure, even in imaginative fiction. He is aided by a further factor, the commissioning of Alan Lee to continue his now decades-long work of illustrating Middle-earth in numerous forms. In that he worked on Christopher Tolkien's Three Great Tales, providing both monochrome illustrations and full paintings, his work here feels like logical extensions of that, helping to bridge the gap between his conceptions of the First and Third Ages on a broad sense. Sibley also provides much in the way of footnotes at the end for the serious researcher, as well as including one of Tolkien's most remarkable efforts, a late 1930s text, written before embarking on Lord of the Rings, where the still unclear conception and chronology of the Second Age resulted in a short, not quite the same portrayal of Numenor on the brink of the fall that makes for some of his most startling writing in places, something we'll discuss in more detail soon. And indeed, while more can be said about this book, it's time for me to stop and open up the floor. So there's a lot to delve into here, new, familiar or not. Is there anything particular that leaps out at you about this presentation, for lack of a better word?
I have kind of a contrary take. So I don't know if we want to start with an immediate contrarian opinion.
Yeah, go.
But I think this book feels kind of like a cash grab to me. The section that you were just talking about, Ned, which is it's like Appendix B, which contains this text that is new to me and that I found really interesting and valuable. But it's just in an appendix, and everything else in this book, kind of including the illustrations, I hate to say it because they're like good, but
get back to me on that one.
Okay, great.
All right,
because
all right.
I like, from a technical standpoint, they're good, but they feel so much more of the same. It's like none of it felt fresh or new to me, and the structure of it, in fact, really reinforced that feeling to me personally. I want to this is all just my own personal opinion. I don't, but the chunkiness of it and I was like, this just feels kind of like reading various Wikipedia entries or Tolkien Gateway entries, and I didn't need to shell out $27 for it or something. I think is sort of my overall take on this, especially because we had done Aldarion and Erendis, which is the crux, the meat of this whole story. So
it felt like a reference volume, which in some ways is like, okay, cool, it's here for reference, but like, who is it for? Or it almost feels like a show Bible or something. And but like, I got it from the library because I forgot to order it in time, and I am kind of fine with that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I need this. It's handy if you don't want to chase information about Numenor down across the many volumes of History of Middle-earth.
Right.
But like, not that many people need to do that. Like, if you're a really dedicated fan artist or fan writer, that's great. It's here for you if you need it. But, like, I don't know. It did feel a little redundant.
Yeah,
especially because, like Oriana said, you could open up Wikipedia basically, or Tolkien Gateway, and get pretty much all of this information.
Yeah, I was expecting more of because what they did with the Fall of Gondolin and Beren and Luthien was superior in my opinion, in that like, you know, it was, you had the interesting sort of scholarly elements of these are the different versions and this is the evolution of the story, while also getting, you know, a full telling of the tale, of the narrative. Whereas this feels much, that doesn't really exist in this volume. And I think that was one of the big disappointments for me.
Yeah, there's a lot less interpretive stuff going on.
Yeah.
And there's a helicopter going overhead, so I'm sorry to everybody. It's like the notes aren't even... One of the irritating things about the History of Middle-earth volumes, but also very helpful, is that the notes are constantly there. They are right there. And it does break the narrative flow a bit, but like that's okay because these aren't complete narratives anyway.
Right.
In this, they're trying for a smoother narrative, but you can't do that because there isn't one. So there's no point in keeping the notes way in the back or wherever they are. I can't remember now. So you're just kind of left floating without context. Like, it would be very handy to know when some of this was written and when other parts were written, because it's clearly a patchwork of multiple times in his life. And I think it would be very good to know, like, have that right there. Like, this is from 1927 or whatever. But there's not a ton of that going on.
Yeah, no, these are very fair takes. You know, I certainly was arguing on the positive side of things, you could say.
Which is good. We should have that.
Yeah. But you are correct. I mean, I do think what you're describing is partially the reason though why it exists. You know, the sort of my popularizer point really comes to that. And as I think we're all agreed on the one hand, you know, all this information is there and it is essentially redundant and has presented other ways. On the other hand, it is presented in such a scattered way that having something that is centralized can be handy. Now, whether or not the goal of the estate as such is the intent is to have this be sort of a new key text, I don't know. But it struck me, and this is maybe projecting ahead, I wouldn't be surprised if they tried something else like this for scattered Third Age stuff in a future year. And the idea being that way you could argue that then they could do something like, okay, so here's Silmarillion, and the big three expanded, you know, through Great Tales, if you will. Then we've got a Second Age book now, and we've got maybe a Third Age book, and then you've got The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Hey, here's the story, in a way that sort of presents it as something you can sort of like, you know, instead of, you know, the hardcore scholars can go to, you know, the history or Middle-earth or stuff like that. But then for the people who maybe don't want to go in deep but want to know a little more, you can go that route too. And, you know, this is projection. I'm not saying that is what they're intending, but I wouldn't be surprised if that might be a partial goal here. It's almost sort of like in a weird way that they're trying to sort of unpack, in particular, Unfinished Tales and spread its contents among various books now, and sort of a way to sort of like, you know, explode it and put it somewhere else. Because, you know, you've got in Unfinished Tales, you have Tuorn is coming to Gondolin. That's now in the Fall of Gondolin book. The Children of Hurin story is now its own separate story, its own separate volume, you know, presented that way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Aldarion Arendis, as mentioned, is now finally given a new central point of place, although I am still disappointed it's not simply issued as a slim volume on its own to make it really stand out. That's the one thing I think would be kind of really nice, just to sort of like, you know, just do it that way and have a very elaborately illustrated version of that or something like that, even as a fragment, because I think that's still, you know, as I think we talked about in episode 4, I think that's still, you know, just a remarkably, you know, one could call it mature look at Middle-earth and his and the setting from perspective as a writer, you know, much later in his life, and sort of telling this, you know, very particular story in a very particular way. But having said that, you know, I think your criticisms again make a certain sense, you know, to me as well. There is a sense of sort of like, you know, there literally is nothing more, it seems, that can be presented. It's almost like Nature of Middle-earth was it. And that's it. And that makes it funny that we have stuff from Nature of Middle-earth in a book that came out a year later.
Yeah.
It's sort of like...
I mean, you do raise a good point Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I had forgotten. We sort of bill ourselves as a podcast that's for the casual fan in some ways, and I'd forgotten the casual fan here, and maybe the casual fan does just want a book about Numenor.
Right.
And I can get behind that.
I feel like, though, if you are a casual fan and you want a book about Numenor, you don't want the story presented to you in this way.
Fair.
I think you want something that's a little more cohesive narratively.
Yeah, one of the disadvantages of its format is it's organized basically chronologically. From the beginning of Numenor to the fall. But that means that things like the story of Eldarion and Arendis, which is one narrative, gets broken up and scattered throughout the book as we go back to Middle-earth for context on what Sauron is doing and that kind of thing. And I don't think that does any favors for the book, and certainly for Eldarion and Arendis, because that benefits from being just a sustained thing. And it's short. Like, you don't need to break it up like this. You're not going to lose the reader if you just have it as one chapter. Or, I mean, multiple chapters that are just right there rather than interspersed with other stuff. So I don't think it's done very well, but I'm coming around on the appeal of having just The Fall of Numenor as a book. Yeah,
it feels just caught in between. And, like, this makes me wonder, we are enthusiasts, but more towards the very nerdy end of the spectrum. When you have like Tolkien scholars on one end and people who saw the Peter Jackson movies in the theater when they came out and really liked them, but that's kind of it. On that spectrum of fan or enthusiast, we're definitely closer to the scholar one. But like, I'm also curious about what the middle looks like, and if this does appeal to the middle. Are there people out there who like are kind of into this and want to learn more and will actually buy this? Or part of me, the very cynical part of me, is kind of wondering if, Ned, as you're talking about, having these volumes as like, more accessible and sort of a set that you can just kind of buy and have, is also a path to a different sort of TV film rights situation than
could be
is currently available. I don't know.
I mean, I do think that this as being like, if Carl Hostetter's volume, if The Nature of Middle-earth could be said to be like the appendices of what Christopher Tolkien was doing for decades, and in many respects it is. It was almost him saying like, look, I've done so much, there's this little bit over, have at it, and he'd worked with Carl for many a moon, and that happened. And so like, okay, then again, Brian Sibley, well, hardly unknown to the estate, of course, has worked with them and things like that, and Christopher Tolkien knew who he was, et cetera, et cetera. So he's not like some outsider suddenly coming in.
No.
It does seem like it's a new, different shift in terms of sort of what they're planning on doing in terms of new work. And that is, it does raise questions. Again, it's sort of like, as I said, as I sort of intimated, they could do a third age volume if they like, but then that's kind of about it. There's not going to be a way to represent anything anymore unless they really find some weird ways to sort of subdivide stuff up and all that, which could happen. But turning maybe back to sort of the thing the crux is on, I really do think this exists precisely because the Amazon deal exists. I really do think this was somebody's idea of sort of like, okay, how do we have a tie-in volume, even though the rights are specifically set up that they can't actually use this material?
Yeah.
It's really weird. It's sort of like you get why it's there, but at no point can they actually, you kind of have to, if you're a Rings of Power fan, and hey, I know there are people out there, and you're like, where can I read more about this? You have to go and find a book. It's like, okay, it's not called The Rings of Power, but it's about Numenor. Is this what I want and what I need? I'm sort of like, how does the casual fan make that connection? I find that hard.
It would be really interesting, and if we have any listeners who are fans of the Rings of Power show, I'm so sorry about our constant smack talking. But if you are a fan of Rings of Power and have, turned to the Fall of Numenor book to kind of get a better sense of Numenor and kind of read and learn more about it, I wonder what you think. I want to hear what you think. Did it enrich your enjoyment of the show? Did it decrease your enjoyment of the show? Do you consider them to be totally separate and you like having both of them, but like you have no opinion on the differences? I would be really interested to hear that, because if I were a fan of the Rings of Power and I read this, I'd be like, what? But they're not. This is so different and not at all what we're getting in the show. Like, I'm very confused.
I was wondering, like, not wondering exactly, but sitting there going, how did they get the version of Numenor in the show out of, I mean, not out of this book specifically, but like this version of Numenor is so different and, I mean, so much better, to be honest. Like, there's a section, I can't remember where it is, but it's basically a chapter about Elendil from his POV, and he's like talking to his son.
That's the appendix. That's
what I thought, but I was
right. Yeah.
And it's got this weird, very weird kind of like paranoid paradise vibe.
Yeah,
like everything is going great in some ways, but also they're like, we can't talk too loudly because the king's spies are everywhere, kind of thing. And it's like, I don't know if it's a very well written story in itself, because it was early on, he's still developing.
Yeah.
But that tone is, I think, maybe what the show was kind of trying to go for, or thought it was trying to go for. And it's not there at all. But here it's like, oh my God, how would it be to live in, like, you know, an earthly paradise that is going sour, and you're one of the only people that can see that. It's gripping, and it doesn't translate to the show.
There's one phrase in particular from that story that is really good. That's something like, you know, men were there in the evening and not in the morning, where, you know, overnight you're having people, it's very like, you know, Soviet, you know, Stalin's Soviet Union, in a sense. And
Nazi Germany.
Yes.
So, yes. Yeah. And we're not joking when we make these comparisons. We're not doing this lightly. This is something, we'll explain a little more about this for the casual reader, because this is important. This chapter that we're discussing, which is essentially, it's kind of, I don't want to say the key part of the book for me, but it was, it's close to it. Especially, it's something that I had read before because I have it, because I have the History of Middle series, and I hadn't read it for decades, because it originally appeared in the 5th book of the History of Middle series, The Lost Road. That was essentially the volume collecting essentially the random Middle-earth material, for lack of a better word, that Tolkien was working on after he had initially worked on the conception of Middle-earth and what became the Silmarillion, essentially throughout from the late 1910s through the early 1930s. And then he was starting to sort of feel his way forward in terms of, okay, what else could be the further history beyond the Silmarillion in the story of Middle-earth? And that's where his initial ideas of Numenor start to come around. Similarly, at the same time, and I always find this intriguing, was the fact that him writing this book, as was discussed in the Fall of Numenor volume by Sibley, is something that grows out of the fact that it was his friendship with C.S. Lewis, and this is something that is well known from their various biographies of perspectives. The idea is that Lewis would write a series of stories, space stories, and Tolkien would do one in terms of time stories. The idea being is sort of like, hey, we're not getting what we want out of these stories, and we like imaginative fiction. Why don't we do our versions of it? Lewis was essentially successful in his regard because he did publish what's now called the Space Trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. What you think of it is another matter, but the point is he did it, you know, and it's its own kettle of fish. And this
I
is
have
not
so
a
many
podcast.
Space Trilogy opinions.
Yeah.
Don't get me started.
Yeah. That's something else. And the point is that Tolkien never completed his time story, but he did come back to it. And this is something where also the Notion Club papers and other things, it's one of those things that, you know, really deserves probably an episode of its own to talk about. But the point is that, so this was written in the mid to late 30s. And this paranoid vibe that Jared and Orion have been talking about, and this idea of, you know, being watched and all that, there is something here that is very specifically much more resonant to the time and place. In other words, what we're trying to say is that instead of application, not allegory, this is heavily allegorical and heading there big time. And it's something that he never went quite as far with it. Again, if anything, tonally, it almost reminds me of The New Shadow, the fragmentary sequel to Lord of the Rings, which has that same sort of sense of conspiracy and things like that, and things are not quite what they are. And again, he tries it, but it's not quite him, and he abandons it. He's like, no, not where he's going. He did, of course, didn't fully abandon this material that he did here, but he did so in a very particular way. And I will read this is not Sibley. This is republished from Christopher Tolkien's own summary of what's going on. This is the final paragraph of essentially Appendix B, and again, originally written by Christopher Tolkien, describing this section as published in The Lost Road. From Elendil's word at the ends of the Lost Road, there emerges a sinister picture: the withdrawal of the besotted and aging king from the public view, the unexplained disappearance of people unpopular with the government, informers, prisons, torture, secrecy, fear of the night, propaganda in the form of the rewriting of history, the multiplication of weapons of war. The teaching of Sauron has led to the invention of ships of metal that traverse the seas without sails, but which are hideous in the eyes of those who have not abandoned or forgotten Tol Eressëa, missiles that pass with a noise like thunder to strike their targets many miles away. Numenor is seen by the young as overpopulous, boring, overknown. Every tree or grass blade is counted. And this cause of discontent is used, it seems, by Sauron to further the policy of imperial expansion and ambition that he presses on the king. And then this is the key point that Christopher then says: when at this time my father reached back to the world of the first man to bear the name Elfriend, he found there an image of what he most condemned and feared in his own. He's right. I mean, it's pretty clear what's going on there. And again, it's one of those things that makes this particular read of the book so fascinating, precisely for what Jared is talking about. It is a very distinct, unusual, and unnerving atmosphere for Middle Earth as we know it. It's not something we sense from almost anything else in the in what's out there in the broadest senses. But you also then sense why he pulled back, why he buried the allegory in terms of made it a lot more vague in what he did write, and he basically went different directions with it.
Yeah, it does make me want to adapt this into my own TV show and use some of those elements, like the idea that young people are just so bored with their hometown and, you know, want to seek adventure, and taking that impulse and turning it into a tool for imperialism. Like, I don't know, I find that very compelling as, like, yeah, how do we get here, you know?
And I think it's interesting how eventually Aldarion Arrendis, as more formally, properly done some years later, when the chronology, if you will, and the scope of what Middle-earth was a lot more formal and set, sees him exploring the beginning of that to a very strong degree. Yeah. But we never got quite the equivalent of what it was like at the end point of it. And it would be sort of interesting to have those two perspectives. Like, what would that have eventually led to? Tolkien lets himself, sort of hint about it in Mendel's sort of like thinking about what the future of Numenor will be when he realizes he's been presented with an impossible choice. But that's really about the extent of it. It's more just sort of left hanging in the air. We don't quite know where it'll end up. So,
and I feel like the Amazon show, like, grasping at a similar thing, but just didn't execute as far as I'm concerned. I feel like, as we talk about it, some of those elements, steal from Jared. It's sort of like the LaCroix version where, like, you wave the element, the thematic element in front of it and hope it, keeps some of it.
Yeah. I think the problem that they end up with is kind of similar to where, ironically, he got with, like, it's too close to real world events, and Numenor is more interesting when you are digging into the specific problems that it has. So in the show, when they're like, elves are taking our jobs, which again, like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Anyway, like, that gets too close to reality, and then you're losing what makes this setting interesting, and you're not saying anything new because people have already talked about this in real life. Like, you're not covering new territory here. But having Numenor be this place, like in that Elendil section, like, somebody says something about, like, every blade of grass here has been counted. Like, they're so bored with this place, and, like, Sauron is really digging into that boredom and, again, turning it outwards towards imperialism. And, like, that is so interesting, and that, I don't know off the top of my head any, like, real world applications that has, but it will say something unique in a way that trying to be too on the nose never will. So, yeah, it's like, I want to. Can I write on your adaptation, Oriana?
Yeah, let's fund this.
Yeah.
The inevitable reboot. Yeah, no, I mean the more harrowing things is like every braided glass account is like the whole Lebensraum concept when Nazi Germany. But let's not dwell further on that. You can sort of play out these implications there, even though there they are. Some of the things, though, I do want to talk about this particular appendix because again, it is really the most extended part of, you could say, narrative that's presented in the Fall of Numenor, aside from Eldarion and Horrendous, which is clearly the other one. Is that we have some of the most unexpected Tolkien writing as well. For instance, I really didn't expect something that was basically verging on, let's be blunt here, homoerotic incest. I gotta say.
Yeah, I read that part and I was like,
what's happening
Mary
here?
Renault on line one, like...
Yeah. And
At first, it's like, wait, is he describing the son from the father's perspective?
Yes.
It reads
It was a
weird.
bit weird. And I know, like, sometimes you come across that stuff entirely accidentally in older writing, and it's like it just happens. It's fine. But it still is really jarring to see it here.
Right. And to give a little perspective here, I will read a bit from this. And, I'm not going to be sniggery about it. It's sort of like, here it is, because it is unique. And yes, I'm trying to sort of square. It's like, okay, how did Tolkien see this? And what is he doing? Because it's so unlike him, is really what it comes down to. At least in my sense of it. So this is Elendil talking about essentially Isildur, although Isildur here has the name Herendil, but that's the idea. And again, the whole section here is that this is on the coastside estate of Elendil and his family, again, in this very paranoid late Numenor setting, as they're just waiting and observing the buildup of what's going on. And here, Isildur, unlike as we see him presented essentially in the other writing throughout, and as long as has been conceived, is at this point more so like, nah, what Sauron and the king are doing is a good thing. Isn't that great? And Elendil's like, buddy.
Let me tell you why.
Yeah, and this is sort of like the big revelation. So it's a different dynamic. But in any event, the idea is that Elendil has gone down to the coast, which he does daily, down to his private beach. Hey, my parents live in Carmel. They don't have a private beach, but I see them. So and just people go down there. So it's sort of like, okay, you go into it. He's looking for his son. He doesn't immediately find him, but then he realized he's been out swimming. This sort of stretched out and is sort of drying, and they have a discussion. And here's the discussion here again from Elendil's point of view. He looked down on the white body before him. It was dear to him and beautiful. Herendil was naked, for he had been diving from the high point, being a daring diver and proud of his skill. It seemed suddenly to Elendil that the lad had grown overnight, almost out of knowledge. How thou dost grow, he said. Thou hast the makings of a mighty man, and have nearly finished the making. From our perspective, this is incredibly weird and hard to read, but clearly that's not what he was intending. So it's just...
Yeah, it's just a dad remarking on how his son has grown. And I feel like if he weren't naked, it would be like, it wouldn't trigger our sense of like, what?
Yeah, trigger a slight ick factor thing. Yeah, I mean, you come across stuff like that that's in older writing, and it's not meant to be like that. It's just this is how the attitude was. Like, you just see you swim naked. Of course they did. Like, it's just a little bit different. It just reads differently. So well, there's another part, I think it's slightly before that, where he's picturing his son diving into the water or something like that. And that's the part I thought you were talking about.
Oh, yeah.
It's described. It's a little bit
more vivid. Yes, I know what you're talking about.
It's so weirdly physical in a way that Tolkien isn't normally, and I think that's part of why it stands out so much.
Like, occasionally in Lord of the Rings, like after the barrows, the hobbits run naked on the grass, and Frodo is naked in,
part of it too is that a lot of the time in Tolkien, people don't picture other people.
Right.
Yeah,
that's a very good observation.
We don't get that internal.
Yeah. So having it happen here in this language is another reason why it just stands out from the rest of it.
Right. Yeah. Here is the other passage that yes, Jared was right. This is a little earlier. I was thinking about that one too. So this is again before this sequence you talked about. He passed under an arch of shining leaves and walked swiftly down rock-hewn steps to the white beach. Elendil looked about him, but he could not see his son. A picture rose in his mind of Herendil's white body, strong and beautiful upon the threshold of early manhood, cleaving the water, or lying on the sand glistening in the sun. But Herendil was not there, and the beach seemed oddly empty. And again, this is something that we were talking about in our chat chatting each other on Discord about how Tolkien was very pleased that one of his fans, as he liked to put it, someone who said no appreciation, was the author Mary Renault, who was very well known for her interpretations of Greek myth, and also noted writer in the books like The Charioteer of gay relationships between men. And it's something like this language almost feels like something from Renault in a weird sort of way, unintentionally, but here it is. It's sort of like, that's an interesting vein that, again, is just, it's so not Tolkien otherwise for the reasons you were describing, that we don't see these type of things described that often, that we don't see these scenarios here. It's an unusual twist. It's one of those things that it's Middle Earth, but it's not Middle Earth, if you will. So it's both is and isn't. It isn't just that we're saying about this chapter, by the way. The chapter has a lot in it, and that is really, really remarkable. And one of the creepiest things about it is something that, again, is nowhere else near described. It the idea with Numenor is the Menel Tarma and is the heights that are hallowed and no one's up there. But the image that Sauron in this particular version is on top of the Menel Tarma, watching everything with a full-on panopticon approach, is wonderfully creepy. That's sort of like, ooh, that would actually be kind of an interesting parent. I almost wish he had kind of gone with that for the more formal versions, but just bringing up there as an option is just sort of like trying to explore out what it would be. It was kind of just really fascinating to me. And I also do like the bit of history that Ellen tells about, like, when Sauron comes on the great wave that washes up the boats deep onto the shoreline, and basically comes out and says, "Hello, I'm here," and everyone's like, "Wow." And again, this was stuff that I remember reading when The Lost Road came out, but that was like the late 80s, and I just hadn't even thought to look at it in all these years since. So rereading this was one of those things like, oh yeah, he did write that stuff. That's a really interesting, type thing. So one of the other things that leapt out at me as sort of like an interesting thing to note, because again, nothing here is per se new, of course, as we were saying, but there are interesting things that suddenly emerge. And let me see what I can, here's the bit that I thought is appropriate to our podcast episode that we did on the orcs. I'm still looking. Does anyone else want to bring up something else in the meantime?
Have we talked about the art? Should we talk more about the art?
I do want to talk more about the art.
Yeah, go. Yeah, go, Jared.
Yeah, so I was very disappointed. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Like, I love Alan Lee. He's amazing. He is a great artist. But we were kind of talking about this earlier. Mm-hmm. There's nothing new happening here. Like, the drawings of Numenor could be anywhere. There's no specificity to them. They could be the Grey Havens. They could be anything except, like, Lothlorien. And it was making me really irritated the entire time looking at this. Like, is this the only vision of Tolkien that we're going to get? Mm-hmm. Between him and John Howe, there's no other air in the room for other people. And it's not his fault, really. Like, I'm not blaming him for anything aside from kind of repeating himself with Numenor. It was just on top of, like, that, the Rings of Power just being like, we're going to do everything the Jackson movies did, the War of the Rohirrim kind of feeling like it's heading in the same direction as the Jackson movies, The Hobbit being directed by Jackson, not Del Toro. Like, all of this stuff, it's so fixated on what these two artists have done and nobody else. And that's not to devalue the contributions of, like, concept artists who worked on the movies, but they're still working under the art direction of John Howe and Alan Lee. So they're not bad artists in themselves. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that, I don't know, we should just, like, get rid of them or anything. I feel like we're in a society where if you're saying we should do something else, you're saying we should discard everything that came before. But, like, there are so many fantastic artists out there who would kill at this and do it in a way that we haven't seen before. Some new fantastic take on it, but we're stuck in what these movies did 20 years ago by popularizing these two illustrators and nobody else. And it drives me a little bit bananas, even though the art is so good. Like, again, Alan Lee is a great artist, but there are other great artists, and we're not seeing them because nobody else is getting these jobs.
Yeah, I would love to see more vibrancy in some of the art.
Yeah.
Like, the color, it's like everything is so desaturated. And I'm not talking about, like, the black and white. Like, I'm talking about the actual... The actual... Yeah, that is kind of weird. But the actual like full color illustrations in this volume in particular, but also in other ones, there's no like beautiful green. Like when I think of Tolkien and his descriptions of the world, the thing that stands out most to me is the green, is how, he's very concerned with plant life, and there's no like riot of color happening even in Numenor. Like I was just looking at the Numenor, one of the illustrations on page like 181 of the Fall of Numenor volume, and it's just so devoid of color and vibrancy. And
well, to be fair, that is meant to be the temple, and this is the people being led up for human sacrifice. So probably it wouldn't be as green as you might have wanted it to be.
Or
I take your point. I take your point, but
I like red, gold. Like there's just no reason to me for it to be so third act of a Marvel movie.
Okay, fair. More
That's
than fair.
what it reminds me
I mean,
of.
some of that is just that's his style, but like
Which is all the more reason to have other
get
people to be
somebody
involved.
else. Yeah, because again, there's nothing different. He's not stretching himself. There's nothing interesting happening, except for, I will say, there is one painting of Moria that is fabulous.
Yeah.
yes.
But the rest of it is like, I saw this in the movies. I saw this in all of the other books. I've already seen this so many times. I'm going to continue to see it because nobody is capable of having a different vision.
Yeah.
Right. No, I hear you. I mean, I was thinking just now that among the other reasons why it was a pity we never did get Del Toro's Hobbit, just for contrast alone, is that he was going to bring in Mike Mignola, who is his own established artist, of course. But the point is, it would have been a different artist, working, things like this, and we would have seen a change up in styles. And there's enough production paintings and other things floating around, so we're like, oh, okay, a different vision of Middle Earth within this larger rubric. It didn't happen, and we're stuck where we are. And episode 50 is there for if you want to go on with that. But here's the part I was looking for earlier. Then I got a little lost until I found it. And in a weird way, this actually is an interesting contrast again to what happens in the Rings of Power, because possibly the most interesting idea that they did, and this is something that Tolkien himself, as we see here, only lightly touches upon, but it ties in with our episode we did on the orcs and trying to figure out what the orcs were and trying to see, hey, is there a way to sort of revisit or review them beyond simply, they got to be wiped out, which is so often the case. And that is the idea that not everyone's on board with Sauron. When it comes to orc kind. And there is a very interesting bit. This is on page 132 of The Fall of Numenor. And here's the section right here. I'm going to read through all this, but I'll skip various lines along the way just to put it together. The orcs of various kind, creatures of Morgoth, were to prove the most numerous and terrible of his soldiers and servants, but great hosts of them had been destroyed in the war against Morgoth and in the destruction of Beleriand. Further east, there were more and stronger kinds, descendants of Morgoth's kingship, but long masterless during his occupation of Thangorodrim. They were yet wild and ungovernable, preying upon one another and upon men, whether good or evil. But not until Mordor and the Barad-dûr were ready could he allow them to come out of hiding. While the eastern orcs, who had not experienced the power and terror of the Eldar, or the valor of the Edain, were not subservient to Sauron. While he was obliged for the cozening of western men and elves to wear as fair a form and countenance as he could, they despised him and laughed at him. I love that. I love the idea of the orcs just basically, hey, who's the pretty boy over here? Are you one of those fancy boys?
Oh, those fancy, like almost kind of like a hot David Brent, and just the other orcs are like, the other employees of the office.
Yeah.
Just like, I can't believe I have to take orders from this guy. Are you kidding me?
But I just love the idea that Sauron, again, the idea is more so like, okay, Morgoth's gone, here's the new locus of power, and everyone's like, oh, to him and all that. But in Tolkien here is the interesting idea is like, he didn't win everyone over immediately.
Yeah.
and this is the way he was doing things. And again, in a weird way, we get a not anything close to this, but a sense of this in, again, possibly the best scene in the entire series was the barn scene between Adar and Galadriel in episode 6 of The Rings of Power, where Adar, who at the time, until the episode completely shits the bed at the time, is more a case of, hey, I'm not, it tries to give this character, his Morroquinde elf character, essentially, the idea of that, no, we are something else, and we are not who you make us out to be, and we are not Sauron's slaves. We are our own thing. And again, the narrative proceeds to destroy that after that. But for at least a second there, it's like, ooh, you've got something. You've got something, and then it ran away. And here we have this idea of something where there is, there are the orcs going like, who the heck are you?
Yeah, they're not a monolith. They're not like automatically on board with, oh, it's evil time? Okay, I'm there for it. Like,
right, yeah. And this subtext that Sauron himself has to sort of like exert his power over these guys as much as he wants to fight the man and elves and things like that. That's an interesting, it's a nice little peek into things. And listen to our episode on orcs. It's one of the best ones we did. We'll, of course, link that in the show notes. So that was Oriana's choice of topic, if I remember right. Good job. So anyway, looking now, we've talked a good amount. So, and you have our opinions. Do you need this volume? I'm not saying that. Is it useful? It can be. That's kind of where I will sort of end this up. But do you have any other final thoughts on this one?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I will say it was kind of I don't know if refresher is the right word, but like looking at this and going, people tend to ding Tolkien for being imperialist, which is bananas, or like xenophobic or something. And it's like, no, here you have this very long, very concentrated argument for why isolationism is a bad thing and why the books repeatedly are like, no, you shouldn't be hiding. You should be out there doing good stuff. Like the Númenóreans, by isolating them, or by being isolated as a heavy air quotes reward, are like making things actively worse in the world. And I think that's a very interesting point to be made by somebody who was pretty conservative overall.
All right, the choice of topic has come around to Oriana, who is going to be in motion and moving and doing all this stuff, but somehow she's got a topic for us to think about while she's taking care of all that. Oriana, what will be our next episode topic?
Well, having driven down to the Redwoods once again recently and, thinking about driving across the country and going through mountains, etc., let's talk about land. Yes. Like we've talked about maps, which is like a great table setter, I think, for land. I'm going to leave it at that. It's a very broad topic. I will
literally,
right. It's enormous.
It's enormous. It's a great topic. I've thought about doing something like this myself, so I'm very glad someone else suggested it and gave it that framing. I think that's a very good way of putting it. That is a very, very good thing. I look forward to that. Okay, so, thank you all again for listening. We encourage you once again to support the Megaphonic Patreon, and that means you can join our Discord community. We understand that more and more people are joining because we're encouraging them to do that. We thank you, and if you're one of our regular listeners and you've since joined, we really appreciate it. We hope you enjoy it there. I've been seeing things today, like among other things we see is our friend Jess, who basically at one point posted a photo of her kids watching the Rankin Bass Hobbit and basically captioned, "I'm trying to trick my kids. My eldest was not into it when I tried reading the Hobbit tour, and 15 minutes in watching it, she said, wait a second, this is that book." And I'm like, that's great kid logic going like, what is this right here? So, and we also like to salute listener and friend Matt Schneider, because whenever he quotes a random bit of he's doing a reread of Tolkien and frames it up, we have made so many jokes. He's very good at pulling out moments and contextualizing them in a 21st century way. It has to be said. That might be the best way to put it. So we thank you all for that. Good luck to Oriana on her move.
Yay!
Woo! Yeah, so we next time talk to her, it'll be after she's become I don't know, a crime lord in the Bowery or whatever your plan is when you get back.
Good old Sunnyside.
All right,
the slumlord of Sunnyside.
Can't
so aspirational.
You can find us on social media wherever you like. Find things. We will say that 2 of the 3 of us have mysteriously appeared on something called Blue Sky, and the 3rd may yet. And when that happens, we may start a formal account there as well for this podcast. But we'll get to that. So time is still unfolding. So anyway, thank you all very much. We will talk to you all next time. Until then.